I wasn't supposed to stay long. That was the plan, at least. After I lost my job and my apartment in the span of 2 months, I needed somewhere to land while I got things sorted out. My brother Daniel didn't even hesitate when I called. He and his boyfriend Marcelo had this house, a 3-bedroom out on the edge of town. Quiet street, no neighbors too close. It seemed perfect. At first, when I pulled up in my car, Daniel was already waiting at the front door, waving like he always did when we were kids. I remember thinking how normal everything looked. White siding, a couple of big trees shading the front yard, the kind of house you drive past without noticing. Inside it was different. Not bad, just off. It was clear they'd done a lot of work on it. The living room was wide open, with clean hardwood floors and big windows that let in plenty of light. Daniel told me they had knocked out one of the walls to open up the space. Made sense. Still, something about it felt strange, like there was too much space where there shouldn't be. Marcelo greeted me with a quick nod and a smile, but he seemed distracted, pale even. His eyes kept flicking toward the hallway that led back to the bedrooms, and I caught him flinching every time the floor creaked under his feet. I didn't ask about it. Not then. The guest room was where I'd be staying. It was small but cozy enough. The walls were painted this muted gray, and there was a single window that overlooked the backyard. Daniel had set up a bed for me, clean sheets and all. Still, the second I stepped inside, the hairs on my arms stood up. Cold air rushed past me, even though the window was closed tight. I chalked it up to nerves, stress, bad luck, but it didn't stop there. The first night, I woke up freezing. And I mean freezing. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and makes your teeth ache. I got up to check the window again, but it was still shut. No drafts. Nothing. When I looked back at the bed, I swear for half a second, I thought I saw someone standing there, right where I'd been lying. But when I blinked, they were gone. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning over coffee, I mentioned it to Daniel like it was a joke. "You guys got ghosts in here, or what?" He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Marcelo didn't laugh at all. He just stared down into his mug and said, "We don't talk about it." I let it go, for a little while. A few days later, Daniel told me they'd remodeled a big part of the house earlier that year. Knocked out a wall between the living room and the old dining room, pushed back one of the walls in the hallway to make more space. He was proud of it, kept pointing out how open everything felt now. Marcelo didn't seem proud. In fact, whenever Daniel talked about the renovations, Marcelo got tense. His jaw clenched, and he wouldn't say a word. It was like he was trying not to hear it. That night, Marcelo slept in the guest room. Daniel said they'd had an argument earlier. I didn't ask what about. It wasn't my business. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to voices. Low, urgent. I thought Daniel and Marcelo had made up and were talking in the kitchen. I got up, mostly because I needed water, but the house was empty. Daniel was asleep on the couch in the living room. Marcelo wasn't there. I found him in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The lights were on, and he was shaking. I asked if he was okay. He just shook his head. "It was here again," he said. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, waiting for him to explain. Finally, he told me. The first time he saw it was months ago, not long after they started knocking down walls. He'd been asleep in the guest room alone, and he woke up with the feeling that someone was watching him. He thought maybe it was Daniel, coming to check on him after another fight. But when he opened his eyes, there was something leaning over him. He said it was like a shadow, but solid. Pitch black, darker than the room around it. No face, no features, just there. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He didn't even know how long it stood there before it was gone. After that, it started showing up more often. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few days, Marcelo stayed quiet, kept to himself. Daniel seemed frustrated, but I could tell he was worried too. He tried to keep things light, cooking dinner, making jokes, dragging me into old board games like we were kids again. But even he kept glancing down the hallway, like he was waiting for something. And then one night, it happened to me. I was coming back from the bathroom, walking through the hallway toward my room. The lights were off. The house was quiet, too quiet. And then I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling that someone was right behind me. I turned, and for a second I saw it, tall, thin, just standing there in the middle of the hallway. I didn't wait. I ran into my room, slammed the door, and sat there in the dark, heart pounding in my throat. I listened, but I didn't hear anything. The next morning, I told Daniel. He didn't act surprised. "That's where the old wall used to be," he said. "It always shows up there." Marcelo said nothing. After that, I started noticing other things. Cold spots that moved through the house, like invisible clouds. Whispers I couldn't quite make out when I was lying in bed. And always, that feeling of being watched, like something was waiting for me to fall asleep. One night, Daniel finally told me the truth. The shadow had been around since they moved in. It followed Marcelo mostly, but sometimes it just wandered the house, like it didn't care who was there. And after they remodeled, it got worse. It's like it's still walking the old floor plan, Daniel said. Like the house remembers where things used to be, and it's stuck in that memory. Marcelo finally spoke then. Quiet, tired. It doesn't care about the changes. It goes where it wants. I wanted to leave. Right then, right there. But I didn't. I told myself it was stress, grief, exhaustion. It had to be. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't. And I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. It was Marcelo who really started to fall apart. After my own encounter in the hallway, I kept my distance. I still tried to convince myself it was stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even sleep paralysis. I wanted to believe that. God, I did. But watching Marcelo, there was no denying something was wrong. Deeply wrong. He stopped sleeping. At least, not at night. I'd find him passed out on the couch in the middle of the afternoon, eyes red, hands trembling when he held his coffee mug. Some nights, I could hear him pacing back and forth in his room, or mine, if Daniel had convinced him to switch again. The floorboards creaked constantly in that house. I'd lie there in bed, staring at the ceiling, tracking his movements like he was marking a slow countdown to something neither of us could escape. Daniel tried to keep things normal. He cooked dinner every night, insisted we all sit down at the table together, but Marcelo barely ate. Half the time, he didn't even look at his plate. He just kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was expecting something to grab him from behind. His face got thinner. His eyes sunk deeper into his skull. He stopped shaving, stopped talking mostly. I finally asked him, late one night, when we were both awake for different reasons, "What does it want?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I meant. He didn't answer at first. He sat there on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles were white. Finally, he said, "I think it wants me gone. Out of the house." He shook his head. Gone. I didn't ask more after that, but the activity was getting worse. We all knew it. Even Daniel stopped pretending things were fine. Some nights, we'd all hear footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, walking from one end of the house to the other. Sometimes they stopped right outside our doors, and we'd hear breathing. Just breathing. Low, slow, almost wet. One night, Daniel was in the kitchen when it happened. He said he saw it, this thing, this shadow, move down the hall, pass straight through the new drywall, and vanish into the kitchen with him standing right there. It didn't even acknowledge him. It just kept moving, like it was following a route that didn't exist anymore. He told me later that he could feel it. The cold that came off of it was so intense that he thought his skin might crack open. His words, not mine. After that, we stopped turning the lights off. It didn't help much. Darkness seemed to follow Marcelo wherever he went, and it was always Marcelo. One night he finally snapped. I heard it happen. It was around 3 in the morning. I was wide awake. By then I usually was, and I heard him scream. Not just yelling, screaming. I ran out of my room and found him in the hallway, right where the old wall used to be. He was backed up against it, his eyes wide, his hands flailing in front of him like he was trying to push something away that wasn't there. Daniel got to him first, grabbing his arms, shouting his name. Marcelo didn't seem to hear him at first. Then, suddenly, he shoved Daniel away and ran to the living room. He grabbed the floor lamp, yanked the cord out of the wall, and hurled it across the room. Then he started screaming at nothing, cursing, daring it to show itself. "I know you're here," he shouted. "I know you're watching. What do you want from me?" There was no answer, just the creak of the floorboards under his feet and the distant hum of the refrigerator, like nothing was happening. Daniel finally got him calmed down enough to sit. Marcelo was shaking so bad he couldn't hold a glass of water. He didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next day, Daniel convinced Marcelo to talk about it. All of it. He said it started small, cold spots, whispers, things moving on their own. Then it escalated. Every time they made changes to the house, it got worse. After they remodeled the hallway, it was like they disturbed something that didn't want to be disturbed. And Marcelo was the target. He said it always came at night, always when he was alone. He'd wake up with it standing over him, sometimes so close he could feel it pressing down on his chest. Sometimes it would move, drift across the room, pass through walls, but it never left entirely. It was always there, waiting, watching. Once, he said, it reached for him. He couldn't describe the hand, if it was a hand, but he knew something brushed his face. Cold, dry, heavy somehow, like it took effort to move through the air. He said he almost passed out from the fear. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it was going to burst. That was the night he started sleeping with the lights on. But even that didn't help. It doesn't care about light, he told me. It doesn't care about anything. Daniel admitted he'd seen it too, plenty of times. But it was always Marcelo it came for. Always Marcelo it followed. We didn't know why. We still don't. But things got weirder. After Marcelo's outburst, the house itself seemed different. He said it, and I noticed it too. The layout made less sense. It was like the rooms weren't where they used to be. The hallway seemed longer some nights. Doors that should have been closed were open. Lights we left on were off when we came back. One afternoon, Marcelo stood in the hallway for an hour, just staring at the wall. When I asked him what he was doing, he said, "This is where it died." I asked him who he meant. "The boy," he said, "the one who lived here before." Daniel and I had never mentioned anything about the house's history. We didn't know anything, or so we thought. Marcelo shouldn't have known either. But later, Daniel remembered something. A neighbor told him years ago, before they moved in, that a teenager had died in the house. An overdose, supposedly. His room was the guest room. The same room where Marcelo kept seeing the shadow. The same room I was supposed to be sleeping in. After that, I started crashing on the couch. And then the radio started. It was subtle at first. Late at night, after everyone had gone quiet, you could hear it. Faint tinny, like an old radio in another room. At first, I thought Daniel had left the TV on, but it wasn't that. It was music, old music, like something from the 70s, and voices, like a sports announcer calling a game. But when I got up to find it, there was nothing. No radio, no TV, nothing. Daniel heard it too. So did Marcelo. One night we all sat in the living room, staring at each other in silence, listening to a football game that wasn't on. We checked every room, every device. We even unplugged the router. But the sound kept coming, drifting through the house like a memory that wouldn't die. That was when Marcelo started to lose it. He became paranoid, insisted someone was living in the walls, said he could hear them moving at night, whispering, laughing. Daniel and I tore the place apart, looking for signs of anything. Rats, wires, mold, anything that might explain what we were hearing. There was nothing, and that's when Marcelo said he'd had enough. One night, when he woke up and found the shadow standing over him again, he lost it. He jumped out of bed, flipped on every light in the house, and started shouting at it, screaming, demanding it leave him alone. Daniel and I heard him from our rooms. We ran into the hallway to find him standing there, fists clenched, staring at nothing. After that night, Marcelo stopped seeing it, but Daniel didn't. He told me later that he still saw the shadow, late at night, moving through the house like it always had, following the old layout, ignoring the walls, passing through doors that didn't exist anymore. But it never came for Marcelo again. And I wondered, did he win? Did he drive it away? Or did it just lose interest? After Marcelo's outburst, something shifted in the house. He insisted he was done with it, that whatever had tormented him for months was finally gone. And maybe for him it was, but not for us. Daniel was the first to admit it. One night, after a week of relative quiet, We sat out on the back patio. It was after midnight. Marcelo was finally sleeping through the night, but Daniel looked different, exhausted in a way I hadn't noticed before. He kept glancing at the door behind us, the hallway window that led into the house, the dark shapes under the patio cover, like he was expecting something. "You still see it?" I said. He nodded without even looking at me. It doesn't care that Marcelo stood up to it. It's still here, still walking the same path. And it was. I'd seen it too. Less often, sure, but when I did, it was as if it didn't even know we were there. It moved through the house the same way it always had, through walls that shouldn't exist anymore, doors that no longer led to rooms. It was retracing something, a memory maybe, a routine. But it wasn't just the shadow. The house itself was different now. The walls seemed wrong. Not visibly, on the surface. Everything looked fine. But there were times I catch myself standing in a room, convinced it wasn't supposed to be there. Like I'd stepped into someone else's home. I found myself running my hands along the drywall, half expecting it to peel away like wallpaper, revealing something else underneath. Daniel started keeping a journal. He never let me read it, but I saw him writing in it almost every night, usually after he'd seen the shadow again. Sometimes he left it on the kitchen table while he made coffee. Once I opened it. There were sketches, floor plans, maps of the house as it used to be, and as it was now. Pages and pages of the same hallway, drawn over and over, each one slightly different. Arrows tracing where the shadow had walked, dates and times marked in margins. And then there were the words, "He is still here. He remembers the way. The walls are wrong, but he doesn't care." I closed the journal after that, and then came the radio again. We'd hear it at night, mostly. The muffled sound of a football game. An old song sometimes. Always just on the edge of hearing. We searched for a source dozens of times, but we never found anything. One night, Daniel swore it was coming from the garage. When we opened the door, it stopped. We tried leaving a recorder out one night, in the hallway where the sound was the strongest. When we played it back, there was nothing but static. But toward the end of the tape, right before we shut it off, there was something else. A voice. Faint but there. A man's voice saying, "Open the door." We didn't record anything after that. Marcelo didn't want to talk about it anymore. He claimed he was free of it. And honestly, I wanted to believe him. He spent more time out of the house. Sometimes he stayed away for days. When he came back, he looked better, like he was getting his life back. But Daniel and we were stuck. One night, I woke up and thought I heard something dragging across the floor. Not footsteps, something heavier, slow. I got out of bed and opened my door to find Daniel standing in the hallway, staring at the same spot Marcelo had pointed to weeks earlier. "This is where he died," Daniel said. His voice was flat, cold. I didn't know what to say. "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew. "The boy." And then Daniel told me the story he'd been piecing together from the neighbor's gossip and whatever he'd found online. The kid's name was Lucas. He was 17 when he died, in this house. His parents found him in the hallway, right where Daniel was standing. Overdose. Maybe an accident, maybe not. No one ever really talked about it after they moved away. The room he'd lived in was the guest room, Marcelo's room, and that's when things made sense in a way. If a place can hold memories, maybe people can get trapped in them. But Lucas wasn't the only one who hadn't moved on. The night Daniel told me about Lucas, the house got cold again. Not just chilly, freezing, like the heat had been sucked out of the air. We checked the thermostat. We checked the windows. Nothing explained it. And then the footsteps started again. Slow, heavy, from the back of the house, down the hallway, straight through the kitchen. Daniel and I stood there frozen, listening to them pass right by us. We could hear breathing again, low, slow, and heavy. Then it was gone. After that, we started finding things out of place. Not just small things. Entire rooms felt rearranged. Furniture moved a few inches overnight. Chairs left pulled away from the table, facing the wrong direction. Closet doors we'd closed were open again in the morning. One time, Daniel found dishes in the sink. We hadn't used them. Marcelo had been gone for days. I thought maybe he'd left them before he went, but Daniel swore they weren't there the night before. Another time, I came home from work and found the front door unlocked. We were careful about that, paranoid even, but there it was, open a crack, like someone had left in a hurry, or let something in. We changed the locks. Didn't matter. Daniel suggested bringing someone in, a priest maybe, a medium, but we were afraid. What if it made things worse? What if acknowledging it gave it more power? It was a stupid fear, but we held on to it. We didn't want to make it real. More real than it already was. One night, Daniel fell asleep on the couch. I was in my room when I heard him talking. At first, I thought he was on the phone. But when I came out to check, he was asleep. Still talking. "No," he mumbled. "You can't. You're not supposed to be here." And then he stopped. His breathing slowed. He didn't remember it in the morning. I thought about Marcelo's final confrontation, how he'd stood his ground, yelled at it, told it to leave him alone. It seemed to work for him. But what about us? I started thinking maybe we had to do the same. Confront it, demand it leave. Maybe that was the only way. But Daniel wasn't ready. And honestly, neither was I. Then came the night we saw it in broad daylight. Makes things easier for them. But that's not true. Not always. It was a Saturday afternoon when Daniel and I saw it, clearly, for the first time in daylight. Marcelo had been out of town for a few days, visiting his family. Things had been tense, to say the least. Daniel and I were both on edge, jumping at every sound. We hadn't slept much, but daylight made us feel safer. Even if we didn't say it out loud, we believed it. We were sitting in the living room, Daniel on his laptop, me flipping through channels on TV. The sun was pouring in through the windows. It was one of those rare days where we almost forgot. Almost. Then Daniel froze. "Do you hear that?" he asked. At first, I didn't. I muted the TV. And then I did. Footsteps. But not inside the house. They were outside, crunching on the gravel that lined the side of the house, right beneath the kitchen window. Heavy. Slow. We both stood. Daniel grabbed his phone, ready to call the police. We thought it was an intruder, someone trying to break in. We moved carefully toward the front door, glancing out the window. But there was no one. Then Daniel turned his head, and his eyes widened. "Look," he whispered. I followed his gaze toward the kitchen doorway. And I saw it. It wasn't outside. It was inside. The figure was walking slowly down the hallway toward us. Same as always. Head down. Shoulders hunched forward. But this time, in full daylight, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It had the shape of a person, features blurred, but there. Clothes that looked old, faded. Jeans maybe. A t-shirt. Bare feet. It didn't look at us. It didn't acknowledge us at all. It passed through the living room, through the coffee table like it wasn't even there. It walked to the wall we had remodeled years ago, and it disappeared into it. No sound, no sudden rush of cold air. It was just gone. Daniel didn't say anything at first. I think he was trying to convince himself we hadn't seen it. But we had. That was Lucas, Daniel finally said. His voice sounded hollow. I didn't correct him. I wasn't sure if it was Lucas or something pretending to be him, but it didn't matter. After that, it got worse. We started seeing the figure more often, day and night, always walking that same path. Sometimes it would vanish through walls. Sometimes it would just fade into nothing. And then the noises started again. The radio. The distant cheering of a football game. Whispers we couldn't quite make out. And the cold spots. God, the cold spots. Sometimes the temperature would drop so suddenly I could see my breath, even in the middle of a hot day. Daniel said it felt like standing inside a freezer. I couldn't argue with that. We agreed we couldn't keep living like this. That's when Daniel brought up the priest again. He'd contacted someone, a guy who dealt with this kind of thing. Not exactly a priest, but someone who knew about hauntings. Paranormal cleansing. He called it. His name was Roberto, and he agreed to come the following week. Until then, we just had to wait and hope we didn't lose our minds. But something didn't want us waiting. 2 nights before Roberto was scheduled to come, things escalated. Daniel and I were both in our rooms when the banging started. Not knocking, banging. Like someone pounding on the walls with their fists. It started at one end of the house and moved slowly to the other. Boom, boom, boom. The walls shook with each hit. Pictures rattled. A glass fell off the counter in the kitchen and shattered on the floor. I ran out of my room, and Daniel did the same. The banging stopped, and then we heard it again. Whispering. It was everywhere, surrounding us, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was a man's voice, but we couldn't make out the words. It sounded angry, urgent. Then the lights went out. Pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the flashlight. Daniel grabbed his. We both stood there, backs pressed against each other, scanning the room. Nothing. No movement. No shadow. And then I saw something. On the wall. Scratches. 4 long gouges, deep into the drywall. They hadn't been there before. I ran my fingers over them. Fresh. Splintered paint and plaster still flaking off. We need to get out, Daniel said. I didn't argue. We left that night. Stayed at a motel across town. We didn't sleep, but at least we weren't in the house. Marcelo came back the next day. We told him everything. He looked skeptical at first, but then Daniel showed him the scratches on the wall. That changed his mind. Roberto arrived the following evening. He was calm, professional. He didn't act like a TV ghost hunter, which was honestly a relief. He listened carefully as we told him everything. Then he walked through the house, taking his time. He stopped often. Sometimes he'd close his eyes, like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. "This place remembers," he said quietly. We asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. He set up a few things, candles, bowls of water, some kind of incense that filled the house with a heavy, sweet smell. He walked through every room, muttering prayers or chants in a language I didn't recognize. Daniel and I stayed close to each other. Marcelo hung back near the door, ready to bolt if things got bad. And then the temperature dropped. Sudden, sharp. The candles flickered violently, even though there was no wind. Roberto's voice got louder, more forceful. He was shouting now, demanding something leave, telling it to move on, that it didn't belong here anymore. And then we heard it, a scream. It was distant, muffled, but it was there. A man's voice, shouting in pain or anger or both. The floor shook under our feet. The walls creaked like they might buckle. One of the candles blew out. Then another. Roberto shouted something else, louder than before. And then silence. Complete and total silence. The air warmed slowly. The creaking stopped. The candles steadied. Roberto turned to us. "It's over," he said, but I wasn't so sure. Roberto packed up his things in silence after the cleansing. He didn't offer any guarantees, and I think that was the part that bothered me the most. He said it was over, but there was something in his eyes that told me even he wasn't sure. We spent that night back in the house. Marcelo insisted on it, said we couldn't live in fear forever. Daniel agreed, though I could tell he wasn't completely convinced either. And me, I didn't know what to believe anymore. But we stayed. For a few days, things were quiet. The radio didn't turn on by itself. There were no footsteps in the hall, no cold spots, no banging on the walls. It was like the house had finally settled, like something heavy had been lifted. We tried to go back to normal, or as normal as you can get after something like that. Daniel got back into his routine, working from home during the day and binging shows at night. Marcelo kept himself busy with his drawings. He was always sketching something, usually while sitting by the window where the sunlight hit the floor. As for me, I just tried to breathe, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I didn't say anything at first. Thought maybe I was just paranoid, that it was the aftermath of months of fear messing with my head. Until Daniel said something. "Have you noticed," he started one night, "that it's too quiet?" We were sitting in the kitchen. Marcelo was asleep already. I nodded slowly, because I knew exactly what he meant. The house felt hollow, empty in a way that wasn't comforting. "I keep thinking I'm going to see it again," Daniel whispered. "Me too." And then things started happening again. Subtle things at first. A door that wouldn't stay closed no matter how many times we shut it. Lights flickering even though we changed the bulbs. The unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs, except we didn't have an upstairs. One night, Marcelo swore he saw someone standing at the end of the hallway. He thought it was Daniel at first, but Daniel had been sitting next to me on the couch the entire time. We both jumped up and checked, but there was no one there. And yet, the smell of smoke hung in the air. Marcelo started sleeping with the lights on again after that. Then came the scratching. It started one night when we were all watching a movie. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from inside the walls. At first, we thought it was a rat or something, but it moved from room to room, always staying just out of reach, like it wanted us to know it was there, but not let us see it. Daniel tried to laugh it off. "Probably just the pipes," he said. but his voice was too tight, his eyes too wide. Marcelo didn't say anything. He just stood up, turned on all the lights in the house, and refused to sit back down. And then the dream started. I hadn't told anyone about it. Honestly, I was trying to pretend it wasn't happening. But every night for a week, I had the same dream. I was lying in bed, paralyzed. I could feel something standing over me, just watching. Its breath was cold against my skin, and I could hear this low whisper in my ear, like it was telling me something. But I couldn't understand the words. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced it wasn't a dream at all. One night, I caught Daniel staring at me across the breakfast table. "You're having the dream too," he said quietly. I didn't even have to answer. He already knew. Marcelo never said if he had it, but I could see it in his eyes. The dark circles, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. He was having it too. We all were. It was around then that Daniel brought up moving. We'd fought so hard to make this place ours. We'd poured money and time into renovating it, making it feel like home. But it never really had been, had it? It had always belonged to something else. Something that didn't care about walls or doors or new furniture. Something that stayed behind, no matter how much we tried to ignore it. It took a while, but we found another place. Smaller but bright, open. It felt safe. We moved everything out over the course of a weekend. Roberto came by again and did another cleansing, just to be sure. He was quieter this time, less confident. He told us to take some things with us, protection charms. He called them, said they wouldn't stop everything, but they'd help. I didn't argue. The last night we spent in that house, I stood in the doorway of my old room. It was empty now. Nothing left but faint shadows on the carpet where furniture used to be. I thought I heard something then. A whisper. My name. I didn't go back in to check. We left the next morning. Now, years later, Daniel and Marcelo are still together. They're happy in their new home. No strange noises. No footsteps. No shadows walking through the walls. Me, I visit them sometimes, but I never stay overnight. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the whisper again. Not in my house, but in my dreams. They say when something attaches to a place, it lingers. But sometimes it attaches to people, follows them, waits. And maybe that's the part that scares me the most. Because deep down, I think it's still waiting for us. Or maybe just for me. If you enjoyed this chilling story, don't forget to subscribe to Beyond Fear and hit the bell icon so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Here, you'll find more real stories filled with mystery, psychological horror, and the supernatural every week. Before you go, make sure to check out the 2 videos that just popped up in the end screen. I promise, they'll leave you with goosebumps. See you next time, if you dare.